was. Alberto and I were trying to figure that out.
1 year ago.
Yeah, 1 year, 1 year. So it was, I think, March of last year, I think. I was talking about the value of values because that was kind of a hot topic. A lot of organizations were neglecting the assessment and care of organizational values for understanding culture. Now I've got a new talk I'm giving, and that's on the truth about generational differences. I've been presenting at a couple conferences around the world, doing some empirical investigations into what the truth is around how similar or different these generations tend to be. It's a very, very popular topic. You can't turn your head or change the channel from CNN to any other news channel, and you're not going to see some expert on there talking about how Gen Y is this way, or millennials act this way, or baby boomers are leaving the organizations, and what that means for the workplace. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of what you see out there, a lot of what you see is, a lot of what you see out there is people selling their books. They have written books about what they say are the differences between these generations. And a lot of them are making a lot of money on it. The first thing I want to let you know today is I am not selling a book. I promise. I'm not selling a book. Instead, I care about the science of things. I'm still very much a nerd, having a research background. I care about using analyses to answer some of these popular questions. And so that's what I wanted to do here. So you'll see a ton of books written by people who don't have necessarily the credentials, but they have some charisma, and so people are willing to listen to them. And the fact is that the scientific and academic communities have largely been quiet when it comes to understanding what differences generations might actually have. And so there have been a few of us working at different publishing firms around the world who have been trying to remedy that and say, let us answer some of these questions because we actually have some science we can put behind it. And so that's what we're trying to do here. So I have to warn you first, things are going to get a little bit technical for a little bit. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible, but the fact is that this conversation has been lacking in scientific rigor for too long. And it's important that we actually apply some empirical analyses to determine just how different these generations are and what are those differences. So what I did was I conducted a major study where I had a sample of over 500,000 people on which I had assessed them for their personality and values. In particular, we were using these 3 measures. They're personality tests, if you will, where people respond to a series of statements and indicate the extent to which those statements describe them. Now, organizations use these assessments to hire the right people or develop the people they already have. The 3 main ones that we're looking at here, first one is measuring more day-to-day personality. So it's how we can expect for somebody to be on a Tuesday morning. The next is measuring derailing characteristics. So these are coping strategies that people employ to deal with difficult situations in order to get what they want. And the last is about values. And values, once again, is near and dear to my heart. It's my favorite assessment that we have. This gets at what drives an individual, what they're interested in, what they need, what they want. So these are the 3 aspects. So I didn't want to just put all my eggs in one basket. I want to look at it from multiple perspectives here to understand just how similar or different these generations are. Now, one of the things I do want to point out is that I've restricted this to an American sample, and it's not to be U.S.-centric, because I promise you I've actually run these same analyses with different countries around the world, and the same patterns result. So you have to trust me on that. The reason why I did that for this is because I wanted to control for any language or culture effects. If you end up throwing in a bunch of different translations of the assessment and people from different countries, then I'd have people in the room saying, well, maybe it's because you had too many Mexicans in there, or not enough Mexicans, or you didn't have enough Brazilians. So it's better just to keep it simple. We just looked at U.S. English, but I promise you the same patterns you'll see wherever, no matter what country you go to. Now, if you look in the literature and try to see what these generations are, you will typically see different labels for them. This first generation that was born sometime between 1924 and 1945 has been called many things. The silent generation, traditionalists, the golden generation, matures. There are a lot of different names for it. And people don't agree with what the name or the label should be for these generations, nor do they agree on where the cutoff should be, on where a certain birth year, a generation begins or ends. So you're already starting to see some potential problems if you can't even agree on when these generations started or ended. Now, to take a step back, just so that we are all on the same page, the reason why people talk about generations is, the theory is that if we exist as cohorts or groups, and we're exposed to similar experiences that occurred during our formative years. And those things supposedly shape us on who we are and how we see the world and what we want and what we do. That's the whole theory behind generational differences. So whenever you look at some of this stuff, it's because of the fact that they, before them, they're Depression era babies, and so they learned how to save their money because they didn't have any back then when they were kids. Or after after World War II, what that meant for all the soldiers being dead and then now coming back and hitting an industrial boom. All of these things supposedly have an indelible mark on the people who were born at those times. But people tend to disagree about what you even call them or why there should be particular differences. So you're already starting to see some of the problems here. These are the 4 generations that I was focusing on for my studies. So we have the silent generation, born between 1924 and 1945. Then you have the baby boomers, who were born between 1945 and 1965. Then you have, from there, you have Generation X, born in 1965 to 1980, and then Generation Y. So the reason why I chose these ones is because we had sufficient data on them to actually analyze and see what the generations look like. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, if you're particularly not interested in data or in numbers, the next 10 minutes is probably going to get a little thick for you. The main thing to keep in mind is the overarching points that I'm going to keep flashing on the screen, because those are the takeaway points I want you to take from this. So when I show you a graph like this that has a bunch of colors and a bunch of columns and a bunch of scales and dimensions and all that, don't worry about that stuff. You don't need to get down into the nitty-gritty here. Instead, I want you to focus on the overarching themes about what we're finding. So here's our first set of analyses. This is looking at the differences between generations on day-to-day personality. Now we have 7 different dimensions. I won't go through each one of them, but we have 7 different dimensions upon which we're measuring how somebody's going to behave on a day-to-day basis. So here we go. We actually have some scientific evidence proving that there is a statistically significant difference in personality across generations. That's what the analyses say. It's a statistically significant difference between the way that we tend to act on a day-to-day basis according to our measurement. Now, let me get into some of the details here, because first of all, I want you to know that the biggest difference is supposedly on sociability. Sociability is introversion versus extroversion. And as you look at the younger generations, and they tend to be higher on sociability or extroversion, that's probably not a surprise, right? And that's probably what we tend to observe in our own lives. Now, the other thing that we have here is prudence. Prudence is, it's prudencia, meticulosidad. It's actually the Spanish translation we have for it. It's about conscientiousness. Now, you'll notice this is actually where you have the least amount of difference. The least amount of difference between generations is on this particular scale. Now, what I also wanted to do is I went through a lot of the popular literature. No, I did not subject myself to reading all of those books. I think I would have killed myself. But instead, what I was looking for was, give me the high-level points that you're trying to make, popular press, on what these generational differences are. And so I just, in a very kind of qualitative way, I said, okay, I'm going to test your hypothesis. Now, the first hypothesis that I had here is that baby boomers are supposed to be more competitive, driven, and ambitious, as I guess compared to the rest of the generations. They're not really clear about that. They just say this is a characteristic of baby boomers. They're competitive, driven, and ambitious. Well, we have that scale. It's ambition. It's right over here to the left. And you'll notice there is basically no difference whatsoever. And baby boomers, even when you try to slice the world that thin, they're not even the highest of the 4 generations. So sorry, that thing's not actually supported. Now, so here we have definitive proof that there's a statistically significant difference in day-to-day personality. But I have some bad news for you. If you know anything about statistics, you'll know that if you take any really large samples of data, and remember, I'm talking about over 500,000 people here. If you take any very large samples of people and you slice them in any particular way, finding a difference that reaches statistical significance is not that difficult. So instead, what we have to look at is practical significance. And that's the bad news for you. These things are statistically significant. They have almost no practical significance. As a matter of fact, what you're looking at here is that generations classifying people based on when they were born accounts for about 2% of the difference in personality. Okay? So when you look at these 4 generations and how they tend to act on a day-to-day basis, because it's a very large study, yes, it's statistically significant, but it's only accounting for 2% of the variance. So when you look at differences in personality, you can only say that generations are responsible for determining a 2% swing, one way or the other. In statistical terms, that's not even a small effect. It's a negligible to small effect, depending on whose rules of thumb you look at. But this isn't a big deal. So now you start to see where I'm headed with this. The same thing occurs whenever you look at the HTS. This is our measure of derailing characteristics. So once again, we're looking at definitive proof, scientific evidence saying what are the differences, not even in bright side, day-to-day personality characteristics, but when people are under stress and pressure and they're in difficult situations, the way they react and respond to that. How are generations different? Once again, statistically significantly different in the way we act, in the way we respond to that. The biggest difference we have here is on dutiful, which we call servicial in the Spanish translation. Now, what's interesting, what you see here is that the Gen Y is actually the highest, which is kind of funny to me, because what do we keep hearing about this young generation? Is there's no loyalty, that they're just as likely to jump from job to job. They're in it for themselves, individualistic, and blah, blah, blah. That's the biggest difference of any of these 11 dimensions. The biggest difference is to say that Gen Y does exactly the opposite of that. That Gen Y actually, when put under pressure, is more likely to do exactly what you want. If you're the boss, they're going to listen to you, they're going to demonstrate loyalty, they're going to be the good employee. So it completely contradicts what we're hearing in the popular press. A couple other differences that we saw here is that baby boomers are supposed to be optimistic. I guess more optimistic than other people or other generations, right? And you can actually say that optimism is probably pretty well measured by this scale that we call skeptical. Now, as a matter of fact, you'll see that baby boomers in red actually have a fairly low score relative to a couple of the other generations. So therefore, just trust me that actually supports it. So yeah, so I guess relative to Gen X and Gen Y, perhaps baby boomers are a little bit more optimistic. Also that they are workaholics. Baby boomers are workaholics. We would look on the diligence scale for that, or we call perfeccionista. And so what we see here is that baby boomers, in fact, are the lowest on this. The least likely to be perfectionistic, diligent, hard worker, workaholics. So once again, it contradicts what we were supposed to find. And also that they question authority. Baby boomers question authority. And that would be on this dutiful scale. Yes, they're one of the 3 lowest generations, so I suppose that's partially supported. Next, Generation X is supposed to be eclectic. I don't know why, but they're supposed to be eclectic, and so that would be measured by our scale imaginative. So when we look at imaginative, we look at Generation X, and they are in 2nd place, I guess, for being eccentric. Not as eccentric as their Generation Y counterparts. And they're supposed to be, Gen X is supposed to be cynical of institutions. Cynical and mistrustful. So once again, we want to look back at the skeptical scale. So what do we see? Yeah, I guess they're higher than baby boomers and the silent generation. And then also the Gen Y is supposed to be optimistic. So yes, that's conflicted here because they have the highest skeptical score. They're supposed to be confident, which is measured by bold or arrogance. Yes, they're the highest of that, so that's supported. They're supposed to be realistic instead of eccentric. That's on the imaginative scale, not supported. Have a strong sense of duty, which is dutiful. Yes, they actually have that. Don't worry, you don't need to keep track. I'll give you the scorecard whenever we finish this, okay? And the smallest difference we saw between these generations, the smallest difference, where is it? Well, anyway, point is, you see the number in the upper right-hand corner. Once again, this is telling you that this may be statistically significant, but of no practical significance. That, once again, we're only accounting for about 2% of the difference can be attributed to generation for how people react to stress and pressure. All right? Let's move along. So now, lastly, looking at values. So looking at values, once again, definitive proof that there are statistically significant differences in what drives us, what we're motivated by, what we're interested in. Okay? Statistically significant. But I bet you can see where I'm going with this. First of all, the biggest difference is on hedonism, hedonismo. This is the pleasure principle. Is it a surprise that the youngest generation is more interested in having fun and partying than their grandparents? No, that shouldn't be really much of a surprise. And the smallest difference is on security, or seguridad. And so that's the need for predictability or certainty. And that's actually something that I found interesting. Because people have always asked me about, how values change throughout your life cycle. And we do see that values are more likely to change than personality characteristics. But I always thought that it was the case that security would be one of those ones that you change. Whenever you're young, college student, unmarried, no kids, maybe you don't need as much predictability or certainty. But as you get a spouse, get a dog, get a mortgage, get a family, you might need to have a little bit more structure or predictability in your life. But this is saying, at least as generations and how they look at it, doesn't tend to be a very big difference at all. In fact, there's some weird spur that Gen Y actually needs it a little bit more than everybody else. Now, just on a couple notes of what the supposed differences are supposed to be. Silent generation is supposed to value tradition and security, right? So we actually have tradition over here. And yes, they're the highest. Tradition's about valuing the way things have always been done, old-fashioned virtues. Is it a surprise that the older generation, reveres the way things used to be done? That shouldn't be a surprise, and yes, that's supported here. Do they need more security? No, and we already talked about that. Baby boomers are supposed to be more competitive and desire status, which is power. So we have this right here, well there, and they are actually the lowest compared to the generation, so it's not supported. Gen X is supposed to care more about relationships, which is affiliation, and you can see that they are one of the highest, but not the highest. Power, they are a little bit higher on power, and they're supposed to value fun and informality, which is hedonism, and that is, I guess, supported because they're one of the top 2. Lastly, Gen Y is supposed to have a strong sense of civic duty and responsibility, which is altruism, and that is supported. They are the highest. They are the highest on altruism, so wanting to give back to the community. But be social and value fun. So social is being affiliation, value fun being hedonism. Okay? So some of these are supported, some of these are not. Overall, what's interesting is that the big difference here is that values account for the generations account for about almost 4% of the difference in values. Remember, the other two numbers were closer to 2%. And don't get excited. I know it's almost twice the number, but you're talking about twice of a very, very, very small effect. You're still not at a big effect yet. This is still a very small effect. Now, the scorecard, just so you know, in my very, very unscientific coding of the comments that I was finding in popular press, what I did find is that of these 19 claims about what the generational characteristics are supposed to be, 12 of them were supported and 7 of them were not. Now the reason why I say they're supported is because, remember, every single one of these is a very small difference from a practical standpoint. Very small. Even statistically, small difference. Okay, but I guess it's heading in that particular direction. Overall, though, and I'll keep coming back to this, these differences are overblown. They're not as bad as people think. Now, an important point here is that generations is not supposed to be the same thing as age. Generation should have nothing to do with age. Okay? Supposedly, we grew up at a particular time, and these experiences happened to us, and they change the way we are for the rest of our lives. Shouldn't matter how old you are, right? But now in this type of an analysis, the way that we're looking at it is age is necessarily a confound, because everybody who's in the silent generation is older. Everybody who's in the generation Y in our data set is younger. Now the thing is you can, from a statistical standpoint, you can control for or covary out age. So I did that. So what I said is, okay, I don't want age to have any effect here. I want to look at pure generational differences. So I statistically controlled for age, because what's then left is a pure analysis of generational differences, not confounded by whether you're currently at retirement age or currently entering the job market for the first time. And so what do we find? So going back to the day-to-day personality stuff, remember that number is 2.1%? It's not 2.1% anymore. Instead, it's 0.3%. If you take out the role of age, and what you're left with is just looking at actual generational differences, what was already a small effect is decimated. It's gone. This is not even statistical noise anymore. 0.3% is nothing. You wouldn't get out of bed in the morning for that. Okay? There's no difference that's left. Same thing happens whenever you look at the dark side of the derailing characteristics. What was 2.2% now becomes 0.5%. Nothing. And then lastly, looking at values, 3.6% once you take away age, what you're left with is 0.8%. So small effects that have absolutely been demolished when you just look at pure generational differences. Okay? So, now here's the other thing too. Now some of you may be big fans of generational differences, and I apologize for the news that I'm giving you so far. But I wanted to give you one last chance. One last chance. Now, whenever you look at the way these generations are typically visually displayed on some Gantt chart or something like that, it looks something like this, where there's a finite end and beginning to one generation or the other. Now, I'll ignore the fact that we can't agree on when one generation begins or the other one ends, but this is how it tends to look. But what if it's the case that it's more gradual than that? So what if it's actually the case that one generation blends into the other? Okay? Maybe it's not just as at 1945, if you were born on December 31st, you're definitely a silent generation. If you're born on January 1st, you're definitely a baby boomer. I'll give them, maybe there's something to that. So maybe it becomes, if you're born closer to 1980, it's kind of like you're a Scorpio with a Sagittarius rising. You know, maybe you've got some Gen X characteristics and some Gen Y characteristics. So what I did was I reran all these analyses, and no, I won't go through all the graphs again. Don't worry about that. I reran all these analyses using what I would call the core generation. So I said, let me take the middle 10 years of each one of these generations. So then you can say, these are the real people who represent this generation. And let me see what differences are there. Because then, you can lose a lot of that noise that happens at the beginning or end of one generation. Now here's what I found. Now remember these numbers here, where it says full generation, these are the same numbers I showed you before. 2.1, 2.2, 3.6, statistically significant, no practical significance. Now when you look at the core generations, there's actually a slight increase in the amount of difference that can be attributed to generation. Now don't get too excited because you're still talking about noise, but I do find it a little bit interesting that there's some trend there, that when you look at core generations, it's a little bit more on each one of those. Why is that? I don't know. I'm sorry I don't have an answer for you on that. But more importantly, I want you to remember that we're still talking about splitting hairs. This is a very, very small thing. Now guess what? Whenever you take away the role of age in all of these, as you might expect, it goes to nothing. 0.5, 0.7, and 1.2. Okay? So, even when I look at core generations, I cannot support the claims made that personality and values are that different between these generations. So without age, generations are not different. Okay? If you take out the role of age, generations are not different. But this is cross-sectional research, and as a scientist, I must admit that. So what do I mean by cross-sectional? Cross-sectional is, I'm looking at how everybody is in 2012, for example. That's not actually what I did, but let's just say, it's everybody in 2012, let me see how you're currently feeling, how you're currently acting, how you're currently valuing things. That has certain limitations. It's great because you get whatever available data you have at your fingertips. What's better is longitudinal data. But it's nearly impossible to get your hands on this kind of data, because what you'd want to do is follow the same guy, you want to assess him in 1985 or whenever, and you want to assess him in 2012. And I want to compare his 1985 self to his 2012 self to see if it's age or generation or whatever, to see if those things tend to be stable. So longitudinal data would be preferred, but most of these good scientific assessments, personality and values assessments that exist, have not been around that long. So you can't have that much data to reliably test those hypotheses. But instead, what I did was something that's called a time lag. Now, time lag is, I said, let me look at these generations and how they looked in 2005, and then let me see how they looked in 2012. We're only talking about 7 years difference here. Only 7 years difference. So I want to find out what kind of changes might occur there and try to compare that to these other generational differences I saw. So what this allows me to do is compare baby boomers in 2005 to what baby boomers in 2012 look like. Gen X to Gen X, Gen Y to Gen Y. Okay? Now, here are the results. Once again, full generations, we've already talked about that. Core generations, that was that middle 10-year thing. Now what we have is within generation time lag. So what this says is that on day-to-day personality, baby boomers, BB, there's about a 1.7% difference in their personality from just 7 years ago to now. So then likewise, if you look down here at baby boomers on values, 10.4% difference on values. That's actually, that'll make me get out of bed in the morning. That's a little bit more meaningful. Okay? But what I want you to know is the pattern of the differences, the magnitude of the differences compared to the between generation comparisons we made. So within generation, you're seeing just as much, if not more, difference just by asking them what they value or how they are 7 years ago to now, as you get between generations. Is that clear? Just as much, if not more, difference. Basically asking the same people, it's not true longitudinal data, but asking the same people what they value in 2005 versus 2012, then compared to asking baby boomers in general what they value versus Gen X in general, what they value. Okay? So what this is telling me overall, overall, is just saying there's just as much difference, if not more, differences in personality and values within generations across time as there is between generations. So I'm just trying to get this from all angles, so because I've already given this kind of a talk in so many ways, and people have always asked these kind of questions. I said, okay. Before I develop a whole stump speech about this, I want to attend to all of those possible confounds. And so now I'm even telling you that within generation you see just as much, if not more, variability than you do between generations. And that'll come up later as well. Now, those are just my analyses. Those are just using the Hogan tools. So you could say, well, maybe there's some effect on your tools or your samples or whatever. Well, I actually got some of my contemporaries, my colleagues together, and we did this at the SIOP conference, Society of Industrial Organizational Psychologists. Competitors. We're direct competitors with each other. We said, let's answer this popular question here. And so we had members from Berkman, SHL, CPP, they're the publishers of the Myers-Briggs. I'm sure you've heard of that. And then Hogan. We all analyzed data in the same exact way, and it was the same pattern of results. The same pattern of results in that, are there statistically significant differences between generations? Yes. Are they meaningful or practical? No. So not even just using Hogan stuff, using other industry-leading, popular commercial assessments, it's the same pattern of results. A guy I know, Kevin Blodzik, he has a great first name. He's actually a really good scientist as well. He and this guy, Ken Demuse, did a really good review of some academic literature on generational differences back when they were both at Korn Ferry. And they summarized all of it, and they found that, once again, looking at other people's peer-reviewed research, there's little to no support for any of these claims about generational differences. Every now and then a squirrel finds a nut, but for the most part, no support, little to no support for these supposed claims. So then basically where that leaves me, it says that research indicates that generations do not significantly differ in terms of personality and values. Okay? They do not significantly differ. Whatever differences exist, and I was telling you about those 12 things that were supported, those differences are overblown. They're overemphasized. They're not as big as they make them sound. So what differences might exist? Whenever I think about what differences might exist, I look at it in a few different terms. Sorry, things not agreeing with me. Okay, so looking at a few different terms, what things could be different? Education is different, sure. What we find is that these newer generations tend to be more college educated, much higher percentage than in older generations. So it's now becoming more common that people have gotten a higher education. Diversity, there's some differences, more immigration and emigration, civil rights, affirmative action programs. For all these reasons, you certainly have more diversity in the workplace. So those things kind of are changing, I guess, by generation. Families look different. You have more single-parent families. Actually, the numbers are not that different from what it was back in the WW2 era, because all the men were across the ocean dying. But it's actually similar numbers. But overall, we'll say there are more single-parent families now than there were back then. So that's certainly changing. People are delaying marriage or not getting married at all. So those rates are certainly changing. And then you have different types of families. More non-traditional families are existing now. So there's some differences there. Political views, what we see, at least in the U.S., is that fewer Republicans in the younger generations. Democrat numbers aren't really changing. Instead, what it looks like is that Republicans are becoming more independent. They're moving from Republican to independent. And you're also finding less extreme views. People are generally becoming more moderate in their political views as the generations change. Job types, we definitely see some differences in becoming more of a service economy. There are fewer men as a per capita, fewer men in organized labor working in unions. You have more people working in professional trades, obviously a lot more women in traditionally male roles, so those are some differences. But I think one of the things that's really important is the technology. You've got Moore's law about how it's growing at an exponential rate. When he talks about doubling the number of processors in a computer, or the speed of computer processors. It's very, very rapid technological growth. But what I would hold out is that what you're seeing in these changes are not discrete. It's not for this generation this change exists, then it doesn't for this next one. As a people, as a culture, as a world, we are changing more in a linear fashion, I suppose. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't go up and down or have an exponential growth curve, but it matters for this generation but not for the next. It's where generally our consciousness is changing in different ways. And how is that going to impact other important things? I don't know. It remains to be seen. But what I can tell you is, despite all these differences, at least what we're seeing is that people are not that different from a personality and value standpoint. So they don't tend to be that fundamentally different. So here's my summary conclusions. Here's what this all means as far as I'm concerned. First of all, I think it's important to note that this is a cyclical and recurring topic. You can have a lot of fun if you have a research assistant do some research for you and then you get to read it, instead of you doing the work yourself. To go look at old newspapers and magazines from a long, long time ago, you will see people saying some of the same things then that they're saying now about a different generation. Let me give you a few examples. One of the things that's most striking about the young generation is that they never talk about their own futures. There are no futures for this generation, not any of them, and so naturally they never think of them. It is very striking. They do not live in the present, they just live as well as they can, and they do not plan. It is extraordinary that whole populations have no projects for a future. None at all. Okay? Who could that be said about?
Millennials.
Millennials, right? I would be just as likely to see this said about millennials. But who actually said it? Gertrude Stein. Sometime in the early 20th century, she was saying this, I think, about what she called the lost generation. That came even before the silent generation. Okay? So they're not talking about millennials. Next, whatever the generation, the complaints are always the same. It is lazy and afraid of work. It is spendthrift and too fond of pleasure. It is headstrong, obstinate, and unwilling to be guided by people who know better. Now, because he used the word spendthrift, you already kind of know it's probably not modern. But, you talk about people, they're lazy, entitled, they want the world handed to them on a silver platter. It's the same thing that's always been said. And this was said by some guy in an editorial in the Times in London in 1925. Another one. The crass bad taste, this is funny. The crass bad taste, even by men of middle age, walking the avenue with their hands in their trousers pockets to their elbows, or in the side pockets of their coats, stamp them as descendants of very poor stock, more fit to parade on 3rd or 8th Avenue than our best streets. The example to our young generation is deplorable. Now, you already know, because he's talking about trousers and side pockets. We're not talking about this day and age. But how many of us have even been guilty about looking at kids and they've got their jeans halfway down around their butts and they're wearing their hats backward and they look like slouches, right? Here's some old crotchety guy in, I think it was 1907. Sorry. Yeah, New York Times, 1907, talking about that was setting such a bad example for the next generation because people are walking around with their hands in their pockets while they're wearing a full suit. So it's always the same thing. We get used to looking at the way things have been for us, and when we see things that are changing, we say what we had was better, or meant more, or was more principled, and we look at being that the rest of the world, the rest of the new generations are going to descend us into chaos. The present generation's condition is that of a man who is only fallen asleep towards morning. First of all, come great dreams, then a feeling of laziness, and finally a witty or clever excuse for remaining in bed. Talking about the laziness of a new generation. And that was said by Soren Kierkegaard back in the 19th century about, I don't even know what you named that generation back then. And then one of my favorite that I didn't find, but was actually quoted in one of my colleagues' peer-reviewed articles about generational differences, is, I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the frivolous youth of today, for certainly all youth are reckless beyond words. When I was a boy, we were taught to be discreet and respectful of elders, but the present youth are exceedingly wise and impatient of restraint. And this was said by Hesiod in 700 BC. Okay? It's the same thing, people. We always look to the young people, say they're lazy and they don't want to work for it. So I think this is probably the best overall quote because it sums up the best. It says, each generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that came before it, and then wiser than the one that comes after it. Mm-hmm. And that's from George Orwell. And he already had this figured out at the beginning of the 20th century. So really, what I see this as being, it's likely just an age thing. What we're looking at here is just older people looking at younger people and saying, I don't speak your language, I don't listen to your music. Guns N' Roses is somehow now a classic rock band, which blows my mind. Things are just different, right? And so that's why I love this classic thing about when I was your age, I had to walk uphill in the snow both ways 15 miles to get to school. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Beyond all of that, I think it's really more a matter of technology and the way that we use it. Okay? So it's always been the case that older generations are not as comfortable with technology, with new technologies. Sorry, it's just the way that it is. I don't know. I mean, you could probably look at it from a cognitive standpoint and say that older people's brains become more crystallized, they're less malleable, so maybe they can't adapt to new technology as quickly. That could be it. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, whatever. There's probably some reason for it. But it's always been the case that older generations are less comfortable with technologies. When young people grow up with these technologies, their brains are like silly putty. You can move them. They can adapt to those things. And so those become part of their regular lives. They become part of their lexicon, the things that they say. And so their expectation is simply that you use the technology. I mean, it's the same thing. I bet you that before the Industrial Revolution, before there were automobiles, there were old people sitting on their porch in their rocking chair, looking at these young kids in their automobiles and saying, these kids today, their expectations are crazy. They think that they can get from point A to point B in half the time that it took us when we were riding horses. And they think that that makes them different. It doesn't. It just means that now that we've got a car, why do I need to ride a horse? I want to use the newer technology. That's really what I think it comes down to. And so just like today, or just like Gen Xers, when we were in the 90s looking at organizations and saying, what do you mean you don't have a website? Why don't you get with it, right? Those were our expectations because we were starting to grow up a little bit more with the infantile internet. Now today, Gen Y simply wants you to recognize that there are new technologies. I know it's hard to keep track of them. I can't even keep track of them. There are new technologies all the time. What you need to know for your organizations is simply that the new generation wants you to try to be less uncool and try to just know what those new technologies are and try to integrate them into your practices. Just because they're saying they think it's a better way of doing things. Their expectations have changed. But they themselves have not actually changed. We have always had extroverts. We've always had people who are people and love to talk to other people. Now, just because social media, Twitter, and Facebook exists now, it does not make people more extroverted. People are people. They still have the same characteristic. Simply, technology gives them a different way to express that characteristic. Doesn't make them more extroverted, just says, now I don't necessarily have to get a bunch of people to come to my house for a dinner party for me to be able to talk to them. Now I can actually just hop online and do it in a virtual way. Doesn't change who they actually are. And then this last point that I want to make is probably the most important one. I'm sorry to take you back to graphs, but it's because I have to show you something visually for you to get the point. We've always done a pretty well, for years we've been working on trying to get people to not buy into stereotypes. We worked very hard to try to dispel myths and stereotypes about gender differences and ethnicity differences so that we can be more harmonious and more diverse in the workplace. And what I'm asking you to do is to do the same when it comes to age or generations. And here's an example of that to make my point. This is the distribution of hedonism scores. That's one of our values. Remember, it's about pleasure and fun and just wanting to have a good time, right? This is the distribution of scores for 3 of the modern generations, baby boomers, Gen X, and Gen Y. So this, you can see this is the percent of the population, and then this is the actual score that they got. You can see most of them, it's more of a like a bell curve or normal curve, right? Now, what you can see when you look at these is that there are mean differences. The midpoint is different. It is higher for Gen X and higher for Gen Y. Okay, so you can visually see that. And this was actually the value that had the biggest differences for generations. But what's more important, and I was trying to figure out how to do this in my crude shaky hand trying to draw this overlap here. But just to make the point, I want you to focus on that area that's in the middle where you see those 3 distributions overlapping together. So when you have this wide range of scores, it means that you're just as likely to be from baby boomer or Gen X or Gen Y if your score is anywhere in there. Because there is such significant overlap in the distributions. So the most important point I want you to take away from this is that you cannot presume to know how someone will behave or what they will value simply by knowing when they were born. You go back to my points about that there is that whatever differences we found are minuscule, small at best. The fact that you're just as likely to see those differences within the same generation over a few years. Okay? And then when you take out age, that all these things go away. You're left with what I believe to be an indisputable truth. And that is that we are far more similar than we are different. And we need to be careful about not buying into stereotypes that just because you happen to be born between a particular range, it means that you're going to hate technology, or you're too conservative, or you always want to talk all the time, or you never want to talk all the time. It's a slippery slope and something that we need to avoid. That's it. Yes?